This week, we're speaking with an expert who has done some research with regard to women in financial planning. What's different for women as they plan for their retirement compared to men? They have different circumstances in their lives, different life expectancy, different risks and profiles. What we need to know about planning for women that you might not otherwise think about. We'll talk about that this week. This is Make Better Wealth Decisions, a podcast about financial blind spots, decision-making, and how the reality of higher rates, global tensions, and tariff instability impact your investments. I'm your host, John DeGuy, a portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto. This week, we're speaking with Tanya Stables. She is a PhD and a CFP certificate. She's also a professor and researcher at the Conestoga College Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning. She's done a lot of research with regard to women in finance and financial planning, and we're going to see if we can learn a few things today. Tanya, how are you today?
I'm great, John. How are you?
Also well. So you've done a great deal of research with regard to financial planning as it pertains to women. And it's the sort of thing that obviously it's half the population, but it's one of those things that oftentimes goes maybe unrecognized, that there are some differences in terms of the way women go about planning their finances and what they experience relative to what men experience. Some people think they're psychographic, but I think a lot of them are actually empirical and financial, that are based on life events and circumstances. So I'm going to see if I can begin with a bit of a preamble here to see if you can help us set the stage for the work that you've done.
Okay, perfect.
So women in Canada face disrupted work patterns and lower average earnings and longer life expectancy than men. So all of those things compound stresses for retirement preparedness. So from your perspective, what should financial planners be talking about? What should they understand when dealing with female clients?
Well, and so I think the question is great, because I think if we just go back to the very basics of understanding that, John. So I think things that we know are women live longer. I think that's a given. I think we understand conceptually that women make less. I'm not sure if we understand the impact of making less, right? And so these structural limitations that you highlight right from the start, they're a compounding effect, right? So if you think about if a woman is in and out of the workforce to rear children, if she also, and she is statistically more likely to be in and out of the workforce to provide care for aging parents, you have a situation where women earn less in general. Research has said that women have lower risk tolerances. So by default, even if they have retirement accounts and they're saving for retirement, the collective amount of accumulated wealth is less, and they're going to live longer. And so I think sometimes we know these individual structural items in isolation. We don't look at how they compound together to create a unique situation that even if women and men engage in the exact same retirement preparedness behaviors, the outcome by default is different because of the structure.
Yeah, so that's the problem. So then the question in terms of making better wealth decisions is, how can the people giving advice, whether they're a planner or an advisor or a portfolio manager, help the women to have the confidence to help their female clients navigate the set of circumstances which are structural and systemic, but nonetheless real, and things that need to be considered. So how do we help people make decisions in that context?
Fabulous question. And so it does require us to be far more proactive than reactive, right? So we know kind of based on life cycle stuff that women enter the workforce usually at that 5 to 9 year period is when, if they're going to have children, that conversation begins to come up. Unfortunately, that often coincides with advancement, right? And so we also have to think about how do we prepare women and support women that if they do elect to have children, they don't get bypassed in that promotional pipeline, because we've seen that also. So very much from an HR structure, recognizing that just because women step out to have children, that shouldn't by default remove them from that promotion pipeline. And it does, right? And so again, on the proactive side, having practitioners be aware that if women are earning less and have lower risk tolerances, that by default, that savings amount needs to be higher. And so where does that come from? From the household, where does that come from, right? And my research also suggested that marriage, so being married, being in a common law relationship, isn't statistically significant from a positive perspective for women as it relates to retirement preparedness. But a dual income household is.
Ah,
right?
okay.
And
So as
so
long as
it's
you've got a
also
partner.
exactly. So it's also very interesting around maybe we flip the script a little bit on where does the planning happen and in whose account to make up for this known deficit that we know is going to exist because of these compounding factors women have. And so it does require us as planners to flip a switch a little bit and look at things a little bit differently and look at things far more proactively.
And given the things that you've been saying, I just thought about this, and I know you and I have been talking about similar things in terms of planning assumptions. Would you counsel people giving advice to female clients to contemplate the possibility of perhaps retiring later than male cohorts in a similar life circumstance might consider?
So I'm not sure we're there yet. And by default, the PhD training says I can't say that until I've done the research myself. But I think we have to consider a few things. Like I think there's a few more things we need to consider when it comes to planning for women. There is a concern that although women live longer, women live in poorer health. So is there the ability to retire later? That's something else to consider. And retirement ages for both Canadian men and women have crept up over the last few years. So I think I have to double check what the latest stats were, but I think men are around 64, women are around 63. A few years ago, it was kind of 62 and 61. So that number has crept up a little bit. And again, the other thing we can't do is we can't just arbitrarily put women in higher risk investments, right?
For sure.
That is not going to meet their suitability principle. But something else that I think was valuable from my research is that there's a very positive connection for women between formal education and engaging in retirement preparedness behaviors. And so recognizing that I think we see that women very much value the knowledge in the decision-making process. And so if we can continue to educate women around financial concepts, we know that women have lower financial literacy, have reported lower financial literacy results than men, both in Canada and the US. And so I think if we help women to develop a higher level of financial literacy, that will improve that financial self-efficacy that you mentioned at the start. And we may actually see a shift in women's risk tolerances. And so one of the things that has been talked about from a research perspective is if men and women had the same levels of financial literacy, how much closer might their risk tolerances be?
I see.
Right?
So it's a chicken and egg thing. Yeah, you can increase the tolerance if you can increase the literacy.
Maybe. Again, that's something that needs to be researched, but I think there is value in that. So when women are more confident, there is greater engagement. And financial literacy is the combination of both knowledge and capacity. Right? It's not one or the other. And so they are intimately tied. And so I think there's value in that.
So one of the other things is that men have higher odds of having a retirement account to begin with.
Yep.
And so when you want to start calculating retirement needs and the fact that men are more prepared or able to accept financial advice, we have behavioral differences in terms of not only how you access the advice, but actually whether or not you even want it and whether you're able to receive it and integrate it and act on it. So what are your thoughts on the ability to have the rubber hit the road and motivating women to be empowered to feel, okay, I can do this, and how can you make them feel that they can do it?
Well, and again, the empowerment piece is key. There's a bit of a structural piece as well. So often when women step away from their careers to rear children, when they re-enter, they don't re-enter into the capacity that they had before. So they may be in a part-time capacity, they may be in a contract capacity. So they may not have access to the formal retirement account they had prior. So there is a bit of a structural element going on there also. The calculating retirement needs is in engaging with a retirement professional. And so we know across the board that men and women, the majority of Canadians, do not have a financial plan and or retirement plan, right? So it's, what is it? I think the last time I thought it was around 38% or something like that, John. It's a low number. But I think the other thing that's interesting in the research that I did is that although men and women sought professional information about the same, men were more likely to accept and trust that advice than women were. And so, at least when I looked at the descriptive data, right? And so I think what we want to continue to do as a profession is making sure that women feel comfortable, making sure that women feel that their needs have been heard, that there has been an empathetic and understanding ear. Now, there is research to say that women prefer to work with female planners, but there's also information to say that it doesn't have to be a female planner. It just needs to be someone who understands what they're trying to achieve and meets them where they're at. And so I think from a planner or practitioner perspective, that's something else that we could do better.
So I know in your research, you've shown that there are men who often have 3 or 4 different retirement behaviors, markers that you can look to get a handle on whether or not people are ready. And women oftentimes have none. So what do you suppose explains the difference, and what can we do to close the gap?
Yeah. So that.
And by the way, what are these markers? I wouldn't mind if you explained.
Yeah. So so there's quite a bit of research that says having a retirement account, actually saving for retirement, calculating your retirement need, seeking professional financial advice, and actually accepting or trusting that advice. All of those have been positively associated with retirement planning from a preparedness perspective, right? Not just an engagement, but a preparedness perspective. So I looked at those all together, and I looked at, the number of those individual behaviors that men and women engaged in. And you're right, men engaged in more than women did. Okay. A higher number of women, higher percentage of women only engaged in one or none than men. And so I think that's valuable. And so to answer your question, I think it's a couple things. I think it's the structural piece a little bit again. So when women leave the workforce to rear children, often if they re-enter, they will re-enter in a part-time capacity or a contract capacity. So there may not be a retirement account option through an employer available to them. Okay. Lower income into the household may mean reduced RSP room or reduced room that they can contribute. Okay. So there's that kind of, again, it's all these kind of compounding factors. And then the other one that's interesting is that although men and women tend to seek professional advice about the same amount, men are more likely to trust and accept it. And so I think from a practitioner perspective, there's value in that information. And so why is it that there's a little bit more hesitancy on the part of women? And so there's been some research, John, to suggest that women like to work with women. We have very few qualified CFP, QAFP women in this country. I did a study in 2024 with FP Canada, and there was 4,300. So a very, very small number across the country. And that needle hasn't budged in 15 years, right? So it's pretty static. There is research to also suggest that it doesn't have to be a woman. So research out of the US says it doesn't have to be a woman, but it has to be someone who truly has heard what the woman values, understands where they're at and what they are trying to achieve. And unfortunately, from a kind of a social engineering perspective, we have often in our profession defaulted to the man in financial decision making. And I think often the woman is not heard, or the woman has said, well, if that's what he thinks, and they defer, right? And so there's two things going on there that I think we need to be very aware of.
So what about the other side? We're talking about accumulating assets and being prepared for retirement, but along the way, people incur debts. And so what about their attitudes, men versus women, regarding indebtedness and having an emergency fund and other sort of more basic levels of preparedness that are oftentimes table stakes that you need to have the confidence to put the rest of the money aside for the longer term.
Yeah. So the two biggest barriers that my research came up with was indebtedness, for sure, and lack of emergency funding. One really interesting item around indebtedness was that for women, owning a home was not positively associated with retirement preparedness. And when I dug into that a little bit deeper, there's a few different things going on. One is that often when they're if a relationship demises, mom will keep the principal residence, husband does not. Husband may take the investment assets. And what has kind of been uncovered in some of that research is that you can't spend your house, right? So women end up then borrowing on the value of their home in order to fund consumption. And I think that is a really kind of interesting factor that we need to think about. More women end up being divorced or widowed in Canada also. Okay, men are more likely to remarry. So you have to think about how that has an impact also, because being remarried has that dual income factor that I talked about right at the start, right? And so I think there's these kind of compounding factors that when we begin to look at why is this kind of the current retirement plight for women, there is a lot of information out there that as we continue to share that information, practitioners can approach retirement planning differently, because we really need to seriously think about what does retirement planning look like for the female spouse.
All right, so let's talk about education.
Okay.
You have mentioned that women place a high value on formal education and learning. So how can people who give advice leverage that to actually give them more confidence and to proceed in a way that hopefully will start to close the gap on some of the things we've been uncovering here today?
Yeah. And so I think, and again, not like a fire hose, right? It's not like we need to run out and give every woman a fire hose full of financial information, but understanding what women do know when they come to you, what they feel comfortable with, and then building on that. So to give you an example, one of the things we do know is that there's been research done that says when a woman applies for a job, they will apply for a job when they know they have every credential in the job description. Whereas men, I think the statistic is around 6 to 70, right? If men have 6 to 70, they'll apply, right? And so knowing the value that women place on that knowledge capital piece really allows us to as planners to continue to build on that. So, finding topics that are relevant. And so if consumer debt is an issue, we should spend time on educating our female clients on the long-term impacts, understanding opportunity cost. What are the trade-offs? How does this impact you now versus in the future? Something else that we know is really valuable, and one of my colleagues did some research on this, was around looking at yourself current day, but then looking at yourself in the future, not as looking at the future as independent of you. So seeing yourself in the future connects you better to your current self. And so there's some value in kind of that psychological approach to planning that when women and men too feel more connected to that future version of themselves, it's easier for them to make better financial decisions.
I've read that there's software that will actually age your face so you can see what you will look like when you're 70 or 75 or 80 years old. And that simply being able to see yourself at that age crystallizes in a person's mind, oh yeah, that I guess I will be that age someday because now I'm young and I'm spry and I have life and it's all happening, and it feels so distant and foreign as to be something that doesn't even need to be considered. But being able to show people a picture of their future self allows them to imagine things that they otherwise might not be able to imagine. So I think it's fascinating in terms of these little hacks, and AI can be a source for good, right?
Yeah. And I think being able, I really agree that connection is incredibly valuable. And I think another thing that we have to recognize, we don't know the full effects. We're beginning to see how it affected students, but COVID impacted all of us, right?
That was my next question. Yeah.
Right. Recognizing that we don't quite know how that changed us as planners, right? So do we now think more in the current day because something like a pandemic could dramatically alter our future going forward? I also think that the geopolitical uncertainty that exists around this world is very hard for people to digest because we're inundated with it. And so, it's how do you think about the future when every day that you're currently living feels uncertain, right? And so I think we have to just be aware of these things as planners.
Okay, it's been a fascinating discussion, and I think we've covered a lot of ground. And I want to thank you for your time today. Before I let you go, Tanya, I have a question that I ask everyone at the end, and that is, The podcast is called Make Better Wealth Decisions. If it was up to you to give some advice to the people listening today, what advice would you give them to help them make better wealth decisions?
Better wealth decisions. I think, so I alluded to it, but I really think that one of the things that I talk about a lot is rather than I talk about budgeting, I talk about a spending plan. And I like people to understand that all saving is spending. It's just whether or not you spend it on yourself or you spend it on yourself in the future. And so I think that concept of current day self, future day self really makes a good connection for people. And often when I am dealing with individual clients, when I talk about a spending plan and I talk about, you can spend it on yourself today or you can spend it on yourself in the future doing this, I find people don't feel that it's so restrictive and restraining because I think they make the connection that it is for them. It's just for a future version of themselves. And I find that is a bit of a good tip.
That's lovely. I'm going to use that. So thank you for that.
No problem.
Thank you for your time today. It's been a real pleasure, and I want to wish you all the best in your ongoing research and the work you do at Conestoga College. It's important.
Thank you so much, John. You take care.
This podcast is not to be construed as offering specific investment advice. Please consult a qualified advisor before acting. My books, Stand Up to the Financial Services Industry and Bullshift, are available online. If you'd like to meet to discuss how the topics in this podcast affect you directly, please visit my website.